starting to feel like a Delta flight. We're getting started at the time we should have left. So tonight's talk is about code of conduct and how codes of conduct end up getting weaponized against you and your project. I need to start this out with some trigger warnings. I was in Gulf Storm in 90-91. I came back with a very mild form of PTSD. So it is with real sympathy that I give out these trigger warnings. At its core, this is a talk about freedom of speech. This is a Linux conference, right? We're big on free as in beer when we can get it. But certainly we are big on free as in speech. If you're the kind of person who is not necessarily a big fan of freedom of speech, if you're the kind of person who thinks there is such a legal category as hate speech, news, there is not. If you're that kind of person, you're going to be triggered by this talk. You're going to hate this talk. This is your chance to make your way. If you think of politics in terms of identity groups and cannot bear to hear anyone who is a member of the identity group that I'm about to describe, if you can't bear to hear anyone who is what you would call a privileged, white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual person, if those kinds of people drive you nuts, you do not want to be in this talk. This, again, is your chance to make your way. I don't want you to be triggered. I know how bad it feels to have an emotional reaction that you can't control. Incidentally, if you don't know what half of those words mean, good for you. You are a happier person for it. It is only with deep unhappiness that I have discovered what they mean. Finally, as Jeremy was talking about earlier, this is necessarily a talk about politics. And when I say politics, I do not mean political parties. I do not mean Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. I do not mean conservative, liberal. I mean the use of power to compel the behavior of other people. I'm going to say that again. When I talk about politics, I mean the use of power to make other people do what you want them to do, specifically in terms of freedom of speech. It's unfortunate, but it's necessary. It's a function of this topic. So again, if these things are triggers for you, if these things set you off, again, there's no shame here. This is your chance to go. All right, we're all in. Let's get started. Today's talk is going to be about codes of conduct as they apply to virtual spaces. Jeremy talked a lot about codes of conduct as applied to physical spaces. I'm specifically not talking about those tonight. I'm talking about them in online, virtual, internet spaces. The motivations and the philosophy behind these codes of conduct, the contributor covenant as a particular code of conduct that gets applied in virtual spaces very frequently, how to resist it if you find it being introduced into your project, the consequences of you attempting to resist it, and then some ways you can prevent it from showing up in the first place. So the motivation and philosophy behind codes of conduct. First of all, what is a code of conduct? These are not my words, but I'm going to read them to you anyway so that you understand what the people who want codes of conduct put in place are thinking about. The code of conduct is there to establish the ground rules for interactions between participants. They're there to codify community values in terms of welcoming and inclusive spaces. Doesn't this sound nice? It's to signal the intent. I want you to pay attention to that word. To signal the intent. If you've heard the phrase virtue signaling, this is a flag for you. Signal the intent of maintainers to create safe spaces for all members of the community, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual preference, or physical ability. Again, doesn't this sound nice? And it's to outline, what's this? Enforcement mechanisms for violations. This turns out to be a key element of the whole thing, and we will talk about it at length later. Again, these are not my words. These are the words of a person named Coraline Ada Emke. This person self-identifies as an intersectional technologist, transgender feminist, occultist, code witch. You don't have to believe anything that I'm saying here. You can go to modelviewculture.com and read everything that this person has to say about codes of conduct, what they are, and why we have them. Coraline believes that the motivation behind having a code of conduct in the first place is a political motivation. It's expressly stated here. From the onset, open source has been inherently a political movement, according to Coraline. It's there in the face. It's there as a campaign for social liberty and digital freedom. What is this other than a political movement? Now, I'm not asking you to agree with this statement. What I am asking you to recognize is the person who makes this statement believes this. Believes that the open source movement, the virtual spaces that we work in, the code that we produce, is a legitimate political ground to work on. Again, you don't have to believe what I'm saying here. Coraline writes this in Why Hackers Must Welcome Social Justice Advocates. Social justice? What's that? So this is the motivating philosophy behind introducing these kinds of codes of conduct. If you've heard of a guy named Arnold Kling, he's an economist. He has a book out called The Three Languages of Politics. He notes 3 axes on which people have discussions in a one end of the axis, other end of the axis discussion. One of those is civilization barbarism. That is, in a political discussion, which things lead to civilization and which things lead to barbarism. There's another axis on which people talk, and that is which things enable more freedom and which things enable more coercion against you. Those are not the axes on which social justice operates. Social justice operates on the oppressor-oppressed axis. What this means is that in society, there are classes of people involved. There is an oppressor class, and there's a class that is being oppressed by that oppressor. This is the underlying tenet of social justice. You're familiar with Antonio Gramsci or cultural Marxism. This should sound very familiar to you. There's more to it than just that. There's not just one oppressor class and then everyone else is the oppressed. There's a variation of this called intersectionalism. We saw earlier that Coraline self-described as an intersectional technologist. The idea behind intersectionalism is that there's not just one kind of oppression. There are lots of little fine-grained kinds of oppression that can be inflicted upon different people in different ways, so that it becomes not merely an individual process where you, if you are called racist, for example, it doesn't mean, when the social justice person says that, it doesn't mean that you personally did something that was racist to any other person. What it means is that you, as part of a racist oppressor class, benefit from the system and are therefore part of the problem. I want you to think about that for a moment. You haven't done a thing. You are being identified as an oppressor class for what you are, not for what you have done. And I want to describe the intersectionality aspect of this a little bit because this becomes really important. We think of the typical complaint from a social justice type person as the straight white male being the oppressor. But it's not that easy. The intersections of this mean that it's also possible for a white woman to be an oppressor against a black woman. Further, that black woman is now also an oppressor against a transgendered person. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. That is the depth to which it goes. And I want to point out that there is no way for you to escape being part of the oppressor class, whichever intersection you happen to be hitting. It's part of your identity. It's who you are according to this. I don't believe this, but this is what these people believe. As part of this, their moral compass is that the people who are being oppressed on this axis are by nature morally superior to the people who are classed as the oppressors, and that the only way the oppressors can get back any form of moral credibility is to behave the way the oppressed people tell them to behave. Obey them. So when you hear social justice advocates say, we are looking only for equality in society, it's not true. If they're seeking obedience, that means they are seeking social dominance, social superiority. Again, this is a political philosophy. But remember, Coraline believes that your open source project is a legitimate ground for pursuing this. I'll give you some examples of social justice-derived codes of conduct. One is called the Citizen Code of Conduct. There's the Open Code of Conduct. There are lots of others. The one I'm going to be talking about today is the Contributor Covenant. This one is written, again, by Coraline Ada Emke. You don't have to believe anything that I'm about to tell you about it. You can read it for yourself, the Contributor Covenant version 1.4. There are prior versions. I'm going to go through parts of it now. Contributor Covenant Part of the opening text is, we're here to foster an open and welcoming environment where things are harassment-free, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, level of experience, nationality, personal appearance, race, religion, sexual identity, and orientation. Well, again, this sounds great, doesn't it? None of us wants to be discriminated against based on something about ourselves. We all want to be able to have a free exchange of ideas, regardless of who we are, right? But notice the things that are missing from this. It is the very ideas that we're supposed to be exchanging that are not protected. It is only the identity classes that are protected. Certainly your ideas about politics are not protected. Do you know why? Because it's a political battlefield. This is a political document designed to advantage one kind of politics over others. There's no space made for your worldview or your particular habits of conscience that follow into how you express yourself. Simply not there. As a side note, I know people who have tried to get those things inserted into the contributor covenant. They were rejected outright. Unacceptable behavior in the contributor covenant includes other conduct which could reasonably be considered inappropriate in a professional setting. What conduct could be reasonably considered inappropriate in a professional setting? It's not defined. It's anything that they want it to be. It's completely arbitrary. Finally, this is the real kicker, the contributor covenant, if it is accepted by your project, it applies not only in project spaces, but also in all public spaces where you, as a member of that project, could reasonably be seen as representing that project. So here's the question. If you're on Twitter and you're talking about something that's not related to your project, does that mean you're not representing your project? The answer is no. You are always representing your project. There is no boundary between the personal and the project under this stuff. So let's say it gets adopted for whatever reason. What are the punishments involved if someone violates the code of conduct? Well, we can ban temporarily or permanently any contributor for behaviors that they deem, that the project maintainers deem, and I love the phrasing on this sentence, inappropriate, threatening, offensive, or harmful. Inappropriate, going along with threatening, offensive, and harmful, is like classing murder with an off-color joke. That's the phrasing of the sentence there. We can ban you for something we thought was inappropriate, but we're hiding that in with threatening, offensive, and harmful. Then, so this is completely arbitrary. Project maintainers who do not follow the code of conduct, again, these are the project maintainers. These are the people who started the project. If you don't follow the code of conduct in good faith, other project maintainers are allowed to have the power to ban or expel you from your own project. That is mutinous. Anyone think that's a nice idea? Yes. So you talked about enforcing. The question is, I forgot the word enforce here. Aha. This tells me that the slides are in the right order. That's great. So, again, you don't have to believe anything I'm saying about this. This is all on the Contributor Covenant page. They say specifically the code itself is only half of the deal. There needs to be an enforcement mechanism, an enforcement team, to which violations can be reported. When you go to this link and you read about how they think enforcement should be handled, you'll notice two things right away. Number one, there is a distinct lack of due process. There might be privacy for the accused. In fact, there almost always is, but there is, or for the accuser, but there is never privacy for the accused. In fact, in discussions with people who advocate for the contributor covenant, they don't talk about it in terms of the accuser and the accused. They talk it in terms of the accuser and the violator. Judgment is already rendered merely by making accusations. Now, that particular part is not in the covenant, but that is how the people who like the covenant think about these kinds of interactions. So that's one, no due process. Number two is that anyone can bring charges on behalf of anyone else in these cases. There's no concept of standing. If I, as person A, see persons B and C interacting, and I, as person A, decide that B violated the code of the contributor covenant against C, B doesn't actually have to think that at all. I can raise a complaint against B and say, B was doing bad. And then some process can begin against that person, even though C never actually felt anything bad happened. What this means is, because of this arbitrariness, this very openness, this flexibility, means that the enforcement of the contributor covenant is entirely up to the enforcement team. They can enforce it any way they feel like. If you've got, again, persons A, B, and C again, if person A and B interact in a certain way, and the enforcement team is familiar with person A, and, well, we know that person A didn't really mean what they said the way they said it, but then C and B interact, we don't really know C that well, and does exactly the same thing as A did previously, well, no, we think C needs to be ejected. We don't like the way they are. Completely arbitrary. So that's the code of conduct, what it is, the motivations for it, the philosophy. Let's look at some examples of how people behave who are advocates of codes of conduct. Who here has heard of a Ruby project called Opal or the Opalgate incident? A very few people. There's this guy, I'm not a Ruby guy, I don't use it myself. There's a guy named Elias Shito. He's on Twitter, and he is tweeting his political opinions about transgender folks. It doesn't matter what he said here. What matters is that he's voicing a political opinion in a public forum that has nothing to do with Opal directly, but he has the word Opal maintainer in his Twitter description. Coraline sees this conversation go on. Coraline, being a transgender person, goes to the Opal page and files an issue against Elia for voicing a political opinion in a non-Opal channel to get him ejected from the project for being hateful. Again, you don't have to believe me. You can go to GitHub and look at the Opal issues if it's still there and see the discussion that ensued. Coraline started the conversation. A couple other people piped up, and then suddenly the social justice mob shows up. What do? They start saying, wow, I can't believe that you would have a transphobe working on this project. You know, this project might have actually been useful for me, but now you've got this trans hater there. I'm sorry, I just can't use your project. Threats and intimidation right off the bat. 1,000 comments on this, maybe more. Now, you might think for a moment that, well, okay, it's maybe not that big a deal. It's got blown up. Coraline is the person who wrote the contributor covenant. Coraline is the person who is making this comment about him being a transphobe. Coraline knows that this is a non-project space. It's clearly Coraline's intention to use this as political leverage against people who have a political opinion other than the one Coraline wants them to have to try to get them ejected from their projects. You might think this is only one example. That's true. There are others. I don't have time to go into all of them. This is another famous one, the awesome Django problem, the awesome Django incident. Any Python Django folks? Few. Okay. So, there's this guy named Roberto Rosario. Runs a project called Awesome Django. It's a collection of awesome Django stuff. He's part of the Django Software Foundation. So, some person, I don't know about this part of it specifically, puts in a pull request on his repository for Awesome Django. He turns it down. And they put in another pull request. He turns that one down too. And then some other person comes along and says, you know what, you should really have the contributor covenant here. You're turning down people of color. And we think that you should have a nice open and welcome space. Roberto says, no, I'm not going to introduce the contributor covenant. We don't need it, and I'm closing your issue right now. This person continues the conversation, and we go literally in 3 comments from, you should have a welcoming and inclusive space with the contributor covenant, to, I will be forwarding the content of this issue against you, Rosario, to the Django Software Foundation to, how did they phrase it, to evaluate your continued presence there. Again, because you are not putting a code of conduct in there, I think you should be ejected from your own project, and at the very least, from the software foundation in which you participate as a guiding member. Now, I would tell you to go to GitHub to look at this, but GitHub deleted the issue. I don't mean that Roberto closed it. I mean that GitHub deleted the issue so that you can't find it anymore. Lucky for us, he archived it. You can see it at that link there. Now, are these outlying behaviors? Because the covenant itself is all about safety and welcoming and inclusiveness, right? This sort of threats and intimidation behavior, are these just abuses of the covenant? No. No, they are not. This is the intended use. The whole point of having these social justice-derived codes of conduct is to be able to leverage threats and intimidation against people for their political speech to get them ejected from the projects that they either maintain or own. War gamers? Tell me there's a few. Some, okay. Few, excellent, right on. There's a guy, war gamers. Yeah, right on. So, in medieval castles, there's a concept of something called the Mott and the Bailey, and I came across this concept on a psychology blog called Slate Star Codex, which is phenomenal. Right on. It's a fantastic. You're not going to agree with him all the time, but you're going to have to come up with really good reasons why you're not agreeing with him. It's excellent. He talks about something called the Mott and Bailey principle. In medieval times, there's this structure called the Mott and the Bailey, where you have a castle tower, very well defended, close walls. You can go up in there and shoot arrows down on people who are trying to attack the Mott. And down below that there is the Bailey, which is where the town is, where the field is, where it's really nice to be. The idea here is that if anyone comes in to attack, everyone comes up out of the Bailey, crawls up into the Mott, shoot arrows down at anyone who's attacking, and then when the attackers leave, we go back down to the Bailey, which is really where we want to be the whole time anyway. The Mott and Bailey defense is this. The covenant is all about safety, welcoming, and inclusiveness. That's the Mott. Well, of course, who doesn't want that? You're right. We're sorry we said anything bad about you. We'll go away now. They come back down on the Bailey and start leveraging threats and intimidation again. This is where they want to be. This is where the actual work happens. Again, the whole point here is not safety, welcome, and inclusiveness. It is about gaining power over political enemies, using leverage on people who are speaking in ways they don't want them to speak. There have been other attempts to introduce the code of conduct in lots of different places. These are the ones that I'm most closely familiar with. Coraline tried to set up an issue in Ruby to say to Mats, hey Mats, you should adopt the contributor code of covenant so everyone knows that you're welcome and inclusive. Huge discussion ensues right there. Mats ends up not doing it. He puts in a defanged version of a code of covenant, but it was a big fight. The reason I got involved in this, because I'm a PHP guy, probably about 3 years ago at this point, one of the PHP contributors says we should adopt the contributor code of covenant, or the contributor covenant as our code of conduct. Big fight ensues there too, one in which I was very deeply involved and one for which I am still paying, which is why I'm here today. I'm not telling you you can't be a social justice person. I'm not telling you that if you like the code of the contributor covenant, even after everything I've said, if you like it, you want it there, have it. Do your thing. But if after hearing about this, you think that the contributor covenant is an unacceptable weapon that can be used against you in ways that you don't want, then you are going to have to fight against it if someone brings it up and tries to get it put in your project or get it put in a project that you feel very close to. So if you're going to fight it, the first thing you need to think about is, what are the possible outcomes from me trying to resist this, or me and my friends trying to resist this? There are not that many. The first one, the best one, is to outright reject the thing, hopefully permanently. That doesn't happen too often. The next one is to fight it to a standstill or to a stalemate, where the idea of the code of conduct being introduced never really goes away, but it never really gets accepted either. This is the current position in PHP land. This thing is waiting like a poison seed to flower again at some point in the future. You can accept a less totalizing contributor covenant, or code of conduct. Again, the idea that your speech is going to be policed in everywhere you talk, Twitter, Facebook, wherever, if you're a member of that project, makes it quite literally a totalitarian kind of thing. You can try to find a less totalizing code of conduct and put that in place instead of contributor covenant as part of the negotiations back and forth. But if you do that, you have to be very careful that it's not a social justice-derived code of conduct, because then there will be a fight later to modify it to make it more social justice friendly. Finally, if you come into a project and there's already a code of conduct there, a social justice-derived one, it's probably too late. You're probably not going to be able to do anything about it. These things have huge inertia. Once they are there, they tend to stay. The next thing you need to do is, once you've figured out what your outcomes are, is you need to psychologically prepare yourself for this. This was the most emotionally and psychologically harrowing online battle I've ever been in. The first thing that has to happen is, if someone says, we should have a code of conduct, you should say immediately, I think that's a bad idea. You don't even have to have any arguments prepared or anything. Just say, that's a bad idea. We should talk about it. Because the number one thing that COC proponents want done is to introduce it and have it get put in place before anyone can say anything about it. Their best option is to just put it in place and never mention that it's getting put in place. Then you're fighting against it already in place, and that's a lot tougher. But if someone brings it up and says, we'd like to have it, act right then. Say, this is a bad idea and we need to talk about it. When you say that this might be a bad idea, you're going to discover that people you thought were your friends are going to start freaking out on you. It's going to be, who's seen Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1979? You are going to feel like the last human being in the room who has just expressed an emotion, because everyone else in the room is going to turn around and start pointing and shrieking. It's terrible. These people that you thought were your professional friends, that were colleagues, that you've gotten along with up until this point, when you point out that you are not so certain about allowing them to pursue their political desires in this project, they're going to be vicious. They're going to be vitriolic. They're going to be vindictive. That's not just repetition. I want you to think about the words there. That is what is going to happen to you if you start trying to fight against this. What are these people going to say to you when you say, well, I've heard some things about the Code of Conduct, Contributor Covenant. That's probably, maybe we should talk about this. Their first response is going to be incredulity. Wow, just wow. I can't believe it's whatever year it is right now. And people still think that we don't need this kind of thing. I literally just can't even. There seems to be a real problem with being able to even among social justice people. These are expressions of an emotional or mental state. These are not arguments. But you need to realize people are going to be doing this. So when they say, wow, just wow, I can't even, you say, well, I'm sorry that you're feeling incredulous. That's not an argument. You haven't told me why this is a good idea yet. Then they're going to start into something that Eric Raymond, is Eric actually in here right now? Probably not. Yeah, wisdom. He has come up with the idea of something called the Kafka trap. Kafka trap is this. I'm going to talk more at length about this on the next slide, but here's the introduction. Whatever evil thing you think is possible, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, oppression of any sort, whatever it is, your refusal, they're going to say to you, your refusal to acknowledge that you are guilty of sexism, racism, whatever, confirms that you are guilty of sexism, racism, whatever. Remember, this is an intersectional point of view. This is an oppressor-oppressed axis. If you don't feel like you're part of the problem, that just proves you're part of the problem. There's a variation on this. Even if you don't feel yourself to be guilty of it, you're guilty of having benefited from the system, so you're part of the problem too. You need to be more accepting of this. Again, this is mentioned by Eric Raymond at his blog. You should go read it. The point of the Kafka trap, and again, the name comes from Franz Kafka's The Trial, where a man is hauled into a court, put on trial for a crime that is never disclosed to him. Witnesses are brought in to testify against him. He has no chance to defend himself. The whole thing is a farce. That's why it's a Kafka trap. The Kafka trap works like this. The whole point of this is to induce guilt in the person that you're attempting to trap via their self-doubt, to manipulate them into a position where you support the position of the person who's attempting to trap you. Everyone here has seen Harry Potter? I'm going to presume, yes. If you haven't, you might be in the wrong profession. You might need to reconsider that. This is Dolores Umbridge. We all remember Dolores Umbridge, what Stephen King called the most horrifying monster ever set to paper or screen. And that's for Stephen King. That's saying something. Harry Potter, just before Dolores shows up, what has happened? Harry has just finished, the Goblet of Fire? Voldemort has returned. The great evil has returned to this world. and in doing so has appeared before Harry and his friend and kills Harry's friend right in front of Harry. Harry feels tremendous guilt about this because he could do nothing to save his friend. He also feels a tremendous duty to warn the wizarding world that the evil has actually returned. It's back. And so at the beginning of the next book, Harry is just saying to everyone who will listen, Voldemort is back. The evil is here. He who cannot be named has killed my friend. We need to do something about this. And there's huge resistance against hearing this, especially from the government, strangely. They send Dolores Umbridge to the school to monitor the school, specifically to monitor Harry, and she accosts him and says, Harry, he's not back. You need to stop telling lies. He says, I'm not telling lies. It's completely true. I saw it happen. And she says, you know you're guilty. That's it. She's got him. Because he is guilty. He feels guilty about the death of his friend. So what does he do? He submits to her will. He's like, yeah, you're right. I am guilty. What can I do to escape my guilt? You can torture yourself. You can carve into the back of your hand. It's horrifying. That is what goes on here. The Kafka trapper says, you're acting like a racist. You're acting like a sexist. Why are you trying to exclude me? They've got you. Because everyone here has felt excluded. Every single one has felt rejected for some reason. Being the weird kid, liking the wrong books, whatever. Until you found Linux. And at Linux, you found an open and welcoming community. They didn't care what you wore. They didn't care what you listened to. They didn't care that you didn't go to the football on Friday. None of that. All they cared about was that you loved Linux. And, incidentally, that you could be productive in it, that you could create things to give to other people with it. That you could write useful code. So when someone comes to you and says, I don't feel included, you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I know what that feels like. What can I do to make you feel included? What do you do? Or what do? They say, you can obey me. You can do what I tell you. That's it. And in a perfect case, this results in self-censorship. They tell you, you shouldn't speak in a certain way. You shouldn't say these things. You shouldn't act that way. And you say, yes, okay, I won't do it. I promise. I'm so sorry. And then you start enforcing that against other people. Why does this work? The only reason this works is because you're a good person. If you were actually a racist, actually a sexist, actually a homophobe, actually wanted to exclude people, that attack would not work on you. It's because you are good. They're using your goodwill against you. It is monstrous. That is what's going on. There are other forms of the Kafka trap. We are really late in the day, and I know everyone is tired, so I'm not going to go over all of these in detail. The real ones that you need to remember are arguing against a code of conduct shows the need for a code of conduct. It's perverse. You are the evil thing that a code of conduct is supposed to prevent against because you're arguing against it. What you need to do in response to this attack is to say, this is a Kafka trap. This is how it works. You're only trying to do this because you know that I have goodwill towards you. I'm not going to let you do it. Well, we're just being logical about the code of conduct. I mean, it's only reasonable that we have this here with all of the evils that are in the world today. This will help with that. It's just totally reasonable. It's rational. I'm here to tell you right now, smart is overrated. Smart is pretty good at predicting things. Smart is pretty good at figuring stuff out, sometimes. What smart is really, really good at is rationalizing its own previous decisions, even if they were wrong. And this is an example of that. When someone tells you, well, we're just being logical, what you need to do is hold them to the form. The only way you can be logical about things is to start from true premises. This is formal logic. Start from a true premise, one or more, work through some syllogisms to reach a conclusion. In this conversation, there will be no premises presented. They presume the premises. They present no syllogisms and go directly to the conclusion. The premises are that we are already all agreed on what needs to happen. We just need to make it happen. That's not necessarily true. Now, I'm about to blow your minds on something. If you ask them if you ask them for a true premise, make them work through the syllogisms, and come to a conclusion, they're really going to squirm. If you ask for a true premise, they're going to say something like this. Now, I'm about to blow your mind. Your brain is going to shut down when I tell you this. So I'm warning you. I need you to keep your mind open. I want you to struggle to keep it open when I say this, and not immediately start looping off to something else. If you ask them for a true premise, they will say something to you like, women are underrepresented in the technology community. That is not a true premise. Now, your brain just shut down. Once you look around here, you're right. There are not as many women in technology. But it would be a true premise to say there are fewer women in technology. Not that they are underrepresented in technology. Underrepresented in technology is a political statement, not a true premise. Why is it a political statement? Because it presumes two things. Number one, that there is a proper level of representation. And two, that you know what it is. We don't have that knowledge. That's not a true premise. It is a true premise to say there are fewer, but then it becomes a lot harder to make a case that you need to do something about it. We don't concern ourselves that there are fewer men in nursing. We don't concern ourselves that there are fewer women in garbage collection and coal mining. Do you know why we don't? Because they're not don't want that. James Damore and you would have some things to talk about. So the point here is that those are not politically important categories these days. Software development, yeah, very politically important. So you'll say that to them. And they'll say, you're just evil for questioning what's obvious. Just point out that it's not a true premise. That the mere fact of a number mismatch by itself doesn't mean anything. Well, now you're not being logical. Clearly, your opposition to this is irrational, irresponsible. Look, if they're not going to use logic, you don't have to either. If all of their positions have been rhetorical until this point, and they're trying to hold you to logic, that makes no sense. You are perfectly fine to respond with rhetoric in these cases. If they want to do real logic, you can hold them to the form, and you can respond in real logic. If they want to do rhetoric and try to hold you to logic, they're trying to put you at a disadvantage on purpose. That's exactly what's going on there. So if they want to claim logic, make them adhere to the form. But then they'll say, what do you mean I'm not being logical? I'm a scientist. I'm an engineer. I'm a programmer. I do logic all day long. Maybe your technology work you do, not your social interactions. You're not necessarily rational about those kinds of things. You might be rationalizing a lot of stuff, but you're not being rational about your social interactions. Well, the code of conduct is there as a preventative measure. It's there just in case something happens. We want to help resolve possible future incidents. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. Have incidents happened in my software project before that you're aware of? Yes or no? If yes, can you tell me about them? Oh, no, we can't because we need to maintain the privacy of the people involved. I can't take that on faith. You need to present some evidence. The burden of proof is on you here, that you want to introduce this thing. Well, have incidents happened in other places? Yes or no? If so, where? And would a code of conduct have helped there if one had been in place already? And again, we have to remember this is for online spaces. I guarantee if you say, where would a code of conduct would have helped? Well, at this conference, someone got harassed. No. Well, at this other conference, somebody got called names. No. I want you to tell me in what online, virtual space, in a project, where a code of conduct would have helped or where there was an incident. Tell me about that. The examples will be fleeting, if any. Well, we just want to be welcome and inclusive. We want to have greater openness to the number of contributors because, and this is true, having a large number of contributors to a project feels great. That's a nice thing to have. So we want to be open to the largest number of contributors possible, and this makes sure that people feel like they can contribute if they want to. Okay. What % of the internet are we open to right now? How many people who want to contribute can contribute right now? What percentage of people, or what number of people is that? Now, if we add a COC, all right, how many more people does that add on? 1%? 2%? We're supposed to be scientists and engineers, right? Let's do some calculations here. Let's figure out how much it's going to be. Do you have any stories of anyone who has felt turned away because of the non-presence of a code of conduct? Who do we lose by introducing a code of conduct? I know of several instances where people, knowing that their freedom of speech was going to be policed, leave projects after codes of conduct are introduced. LLVM is just one of them. It has occurred to me, since writing this, that when social justice advocates talk about greater openness, they're not talking about the number of people. They're talking about the number of classes of identities. That is, we want to have more kinds of contributors, not just more contributors total. We want more I don't know how to phrase this, more intersectionality points. Remember we talked about that before. We need more intersections of people. You're going to argue against it. You can say, we probably shouldn't have this. One of the responses is going to be, well, you can't just be against things, Paul. You need to be constructive. You need to help us make this better if you want to make it better. Well, to paraphrase Ayn Rand, what is constructive depends on what it is you want to construct. If someone comes to your project and says, I've put together a new feature for you, here's all the code, just go ahead and merge it. You look at the feature and you realize this is not at all what the project is about. You are fully within your rights to hit close on that issue and say, nope, I'm not taking it. That's not what we're about. Thanks. Well, you can't just close my issue. You need to help me improve it. No, I don't. I don't think this feature is necessary, and you haven't done the work to make it good. That's not my fault. That's your fault. Same thing with the code of conduct. You can reject it outright without having to be constructive about it as a completely unnecessary feature. There's a bunch of other attacks. Why do you want to enable racism, sexism, whatever? It's Kafka trap. Code of conduct is everywhere, all the time. It's inevitable. Just lay back and let it happen. Don't fight against it. You'll lose anyway. No, not true. People have fought against it. I personally have fought against them. They can be, at the very least, delayed, if not outright rejected. Well, Paul, programming is a social activity. There need to be social rules around this. This one's really tempting. Because anytime people are involved interacting with each other, we'll say, well, it's social, and there needs to be social rules around it, and there needs to be justice in those interactions. Programming is not a social activity. No more than football is a social activity. It is a team activity. It is a cooperative activity. People are involved, but the point of it is to produce something at the end, not to police the interactions between the people doing the producing. Well, if you don't like a code of conduct, you can contribute elsewhere. I love this one, because this is assuming the sale. Anyone in sales knows what that means. They're presuming the code of conduct is already passed. If you don't like it, you can just go elsewhere. That argument works in your favor. There's no code of conduct now. You know what? If you don't like that there's no code of conduct, you can go elsewhere. Like Captain America used to say, you move. I'm staying right here. The last thing. This is the one that really gets me angry. A free and open society, which we're trying to have here, does not just mean that government can't police your speech. It means that we as members of a free and open society honor and recognize the freedoms of other people to speak in the ways they want, even if those ways are offensive to us. We tolerate things we don't like in a free and open society. The social justice advocate then says, well, yeah, you can have free speech, but you don't get freedom from consequences. All right, this is true. What are the proper consequences for speech that you don't like? Is it to burn down my house? Is it to call in a SWAT team to kick in my door and shoot me and my dog? Is it to see me on the street and punch me? Is it to call my employer and say, did you know that Paul has an offensive opinion? Is that really the kind of person you want working for you? Are those the proper consequences for speech? No. The proper consequences for speech that you don't like is speech in return. Arguments, not incitements to action against the person you don't like. Those are some of the attacks and defenses you can make against them. When you decide to do this, when you really decide to make this fight, follow your venue rules as closely as possible. If it's on a mailing list, follow the posting guidelines. If it's a forum, follow the posting guidelines. Your initial desire, my initial desire anyway, I'm not a patient man by nature. I want to respond to each argument as it comes in instantaneously. This looks bad. What you want to do is, once you have voiced your initial objection, Let replies collect up for a day, maybe a day and a half. Put them all together and then respond all of them at once in a single email or a single forum post. When you respond, be sure to criticize the ideas of the people presented, the ideas being presented, not the people presenting them. This is going to be very tough to do. This is one that I haven't done, but I think would work very well, and that is to address the proposer directly. Person A is going to say, we should have a code of conduct. Persons B through Z are going to say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and then we can this, and then we can that, and this will help with that. Don't address persons B through Z. Address the proposer. And say, hey, person B said that this and this and this is true. Do you believe that's true, person A proposing this? And make them personally responsible for trying to introduce this thing in the first place. If you can find actual friendlies in this, coordinate with them. There's nothing wrong with presenting a team effort against this. You do not have to go it alone. Do make sure that they are actual friendlies. This may mean coordinating with them outside of the normal project channels, but do it. You're going to be surprised at how many people are there to help you who are scared to death to speak up. You may have to be their voice, but you can coordinate with them and either get moral support or get actual support on your, through your communications form. Finally, and this is something I fall into every time, is that it's very tempting to mock the proposal or to call the proposal totalitarian or to call it literally fascist. Everything is bound together. Don't do this. It shuts their brains down. No productive conversation occurs after this. You need to keep things going. That will not do it. Again, I have made mistakes that lead me to advise this. The number one thing you should never, ever do to a social justice advocate is apologize. And right now you're thinking, well, wait a minute. What if I've actually done something that's wrong? I should apologize. That's what a good person does. You're right. That is what a good person does. And a good person receives an apology with goodwill. It becomes a termination point. An apology to a social justice advocate is an admission of guilt on your part for being evil. Remember, the social justice advocate, there's no such thing as a racist action. There is not a sexist action. There's not a misogynist action. These are not things that you do. These are things that you are. And if you say, you know what, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, you're right. You're a racist. Clearly, you just admitted it. Now we really need to kick you out of the project. So you can't do it much as you want to. You never apologize. You double down if you have to. You do that long enough, they will leave you alone. But it'll take a while. Further, never resign. There will be calls for you to say, well, if you don't like this, maybe you should just go. Maybe this project isn't for you anymore. Don't do it. Because anyone else on the outside looking in says, oh, look, he resigned voluntarily. He didn't have to do that. He must have wanted to leave. No. And the social justice advocates will say the same thing. Well, we don't know what happened. You just decided to go. Don't do it. Make them force you out. Again, this is going to be psychologically painful to do, but it's the only way. You need to make them do the work. What are the consequences of resisting contributor covenant or the introduction of another social justice-derived code of conduct? Both during and after your resistance, you're going to be denounced and disparaged by the people you thought were your friends. You've had great relations with these people for years, and all of a sudden they're going to start saying the most horrifying lies about you in public. There will be calls to expel you from the project that you're performing your resistance in. There will be further calls from other people watching to say, oh, wow, Paul doesn't, whoever it is, doesn't want a code of conduct in that project. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have him here either. We should probably eject him here. Your employment and your career will be threatened outright. You remember what I said earlier? Is one of the proper responses to speech to call your employer and just sort of inform the employer that this is not great. Your employers, they may be great, but they're cowards. Their HR department, they're not going to go to bat for you. They get half a dozen calls saying that we're going to boycott your advertisers or boycott your advertisers, your clients, unless you fire somebody. You're going to get fired. It's going to happen. So you need to warn your employers in advance, your family and friends in advance, that if you're doing this, they might start getting phone calls about what a terrible person you are. You will receive unofficial, informal sanction. Anyone who's familiar with the workings of the Soviet Union will understand what this means. The Soviet Union, if you didn't toe the political line, no one did anything to you. Government didn't necessarily come after you. You just couldn't find a job anymore. You couldn't get anything published in the paper. People wouldn't speak to you anymore. And that is what will happen here. Your proposals to conferences and your papers and publications will be rejected outright. Sorry, that's just not the kind of thing we're looking for right now. Try again next month. The people you used to associate with won't associate with you anymore. You will always be remembered with resentment by the proponents of the Code of Conduct because you have thwarted their political will. The fight will have to be its own reward in this case. You have to choose for yourself whether you want to go through that or not. Whether the idea of freedom of speech, to not be policed by people who don't like you, is something to fight for or not. Really, the best thing would not have to fight at all. How can we prevent the introduction of a Code of Conduct? There are preemptive actions we can take. BDFL projects are the easiest one to do this in. Benevolent dictator for life. You can just say, here's a Code of Conduct. I'm putting this one in place. It's done. It's harder to prevent in democratic decentralized projects because everyone's going to have a vote. Everyone's going to have a different idea of how it should happen. Cthulhu swims slowly, but he only swims left, and left is social justice. Well, here's the thing. Once power is available, once a kind of power is known to be available in a system, in a social system, people will seek to use that power. Just the same way that nature abhors a vacuum and seeks to fill it, people seek to fill a power vacuum as well. So you need to fill it preemptively with a code of conduct of your own. Here are some alternatives. There's the Code of Merit. This is a specifically meritocracy-oriented one. This one's by Roberto Rosario of Awesome Django. He put this together after going through that altercation. There's the No Code of Conduct, which says essentially we have no code of conduct. Deal with it. There's the Ruby Community Conduct Guideline, which was written by Matz. This is a defanged version, a very short version, Contributor Code of Covenant. This one is very nice. This is Linux conference, the Linux Code of Conflict. This one is also very nice. Got two more. The one for Red Hat. Now, this is the one place where I'm going to break my rule and use a physical conference space code of conduct for a virtual space code of conduct. This is beautiful. We expect everyone to conduct themselves professionally and respectfully. The last one, this is, anyone here read Vox Day? Any Vox folks? Right on. A few, excellent. As a side note, there's a book called SJWs Always Lie, written by Vox Day, from which this comes. It's a fantastic book about fighting against social justice advocates. Vox Day COC says this is the code of conduct. This is the code of conduct. Point 2 is, anyone trying to change the code of conduct, you're out. It becomes a non-issue. This is like fitting the key in the neuron receptor so that it never gets activated. Whatever you do when you pick your own code of conduct, and social justice folks are going to come back to you and say, oh, you really shouldn't pick your own. You should use the one that's tried and vetted, one that's a best practice in the community. Nah. Make sure that whatever one you pick limits its scope to project channels only. You're not here to police Twitter. You're not here to police Facebook. You're not here to police anything other than your project channels. You want to make sure that you protect freedom of speech and freedom of association, explicitly if necessary, in these other channels. Eliminate all references or protections to group identity classes. None of this intersectionalism stuff. Just don't even mention it. Why do you care what their identity is? Why should they care what yours is? Concentrate on the shared project goals, not the differing identity groups that might be working towards that project together. Finally, make sure that it removes any form of arbitrary policing power. And if you've got some form of enforcement mechanism, which I do not recommend, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't recommend it, make sure the due process gets protected here. But remember, you're not the police. You're not the courts. This is probably not what you should be doing. Finally, after all that, I hate this talk. I hate talking about politics. I don't want to see any more of it than I absolutely have to. It's bad enough seeing it in the rest of my life. I sure don't want to see it in my professional life, in an open source world where, again, we're trying to have a free and open society where it used to be that your politics didn't matter. I didn't care who was on the other end of the stupid internet connection. I cared but they put in a patch for a bug that I missed that's been sitting there for a year. Thank God they found it. That's what I care about, not this. But you got to remember, Coraline said this is a legitimate political ground to work in. You're in a gun fight, you need a gun. If you're in a religious war, you need a religion. If you're in a political battle, you have to deal with politics. I don't like it any more than I like conflict in the first place. I don't want to start anything with anyone. By God, someone pushes me, I'm pushing back. I'm not going to let it happen. That's what you're going to have to do too. Your freedom of speech is under attack. Yours, personally. Using leverage over your membership, using as leverage membership in this project that you love. If you don't defend that, who do you think will? This is a running theme from a lot of my other talks. No one is coming to save you. Nobody's coming. You're going to have to save yourselves on this. And I hope that this talk has been the beginning of a way for you to find both the tools and the psychological strength to do so. Thank you very much for your time. It is 8:30. Thank you for saying. It's 8:30. I know everyone's tired and wants to get to the bar. I will stay here as long as anyone else wants to stay to talk about this.
I would like to say one thing, Paul.
Yeah.
You and I have more in common than we have apart.
Yeah.
I'm 46, I'm white, I'm male, I'm cis, I'm married, I'm hetero, all that stuff. I'm also a Desert Storm veteran. I disagree with most of your conclusions and premises here, but I have no desire to demonize you.
Praise the Lord, brother.
I do feel that you have spent this last chunk of time demonizing the crap out of anybody on the other side with nobody there to say anything about it. Thank you.
So no, let's hear this. Yeah.
This is not the time to take this further. It's late. We're all tired. I don't know about you, but I got to piss like a racer. With that said, at another time, if you would like to maybe have a panel and we can discuss these things back and forth and we can start from premises and we can follow on to conclusions, maybe everybody can come to a little bit more understanding about the other side.
Are we still recording on this? Because I want to make sure that gets commented on. Are we still recording? Do we know?